In this video, I'd like to help you with your beginning studies in Classical Reasoning 1. In this course, we're going to study the first two books of Aristotle's Organon. That's the Categories and On Interpretation. But first, before we get into those books, we're going to study another book written by a philosopher named Porphyry, who wrote an introduction for students to prepare them for the study of Aristotle's Categories. So for these first few lessons, we're going to study Porphyry's introduction, and in this first lesson, we're going to study chapter 1 in that book. Now, what I'm going to do in this video is simply make this first reading of the lesson with you and make a few comments along the way to help you get through that first reading. What I want you to do is find the article on the CLA website titled How to Study for Mastery, and I want you to read that article. What we do together here in this video is going to be your first reading, but you'll see that article explains for you how to go about studying for mastery so that you can learn this lesson and all the lessons to come. We're going to be studying difficult content in these lessons, and you need to learn how to study that content in order to be able to master it and continue moving on in these courses. So, how to study for mastery. Find that article and follow the instructions in it. We're going to read together chapter 1 of Porphyry's introduction to the Categories of Aristotle. So let's read it together. Porphyry writes, "Since it is necessary, both for the doctrine of the Categories of Aristotle and for the formation of definitions, and in short, for those things which pertain to division and demonstration, to know what genus and difference, species, peculiarity, and accident are, and since also the theory of these is useful, in a summary way, I will briefly endeavor to discuss for you in the form, as it were, of an introduction, what has been delivered on this subject by the ancients, abstaining from more profound investigations, but appropriately directing my attention to such as are more simple." In this introduction, what Porphyry does for us that's very helpful is he tells us that there are 5 terms that need to be understood clearly before we enter into the study of Aristotle's Categories. He says these 5 terms, which can be a cause of confusion and can hinder our progress in studying Aristotle's Categories, need to be understood first. And he's going, in this introduction, he's going to clarify what these terms mean in Aristotle's writings so that we can enter into Aristotle and not struggle with confusion. The first term he says we need to learn is genus. Okay? Second is difference. Third is species. Fourth is peculiarity. And fifth is accident. Okay? So the point of Porphyry's introduction is to clarify for us the meaning of these 5 terms: genus, difference, species, peculiarity, and accident. All right, it's very simple. Knowing the meaning of those 5 terms is our goal in the study of this first book in Classical Reasoning 1, the introduction of Porphyry. He says it's necessary to know these 5 terms for the doctrine of the Categories of Aristotle. That's our primary concern in studying this book. He says it's also helpful to understand how to form definitions, and we'll learn how definitions are formed. If you look in a dictionary and say, how does a dictionary, the authors of the dictionary, how do they decide to create a definition for a term? Well, there's a certain formula that they use that's based on these 5 terms, okay? And we're going to learn that as we read through Porphyry's introduction. So obviously defining terms is very important, and thinking of a time in history where they didn't have access to dictionaries like we do. Part of the job of any student was to accurately define terms, not only when he spoke or wrote, but when he studied, to make sure that he understood the vocabulary in its context, which is something I talk about a lot. That words need to be understood in the context in which they're used, not just in general. For example, these 5 terms, genus, difference, species, peculiarity, and accident, they're terms that other writers use in different ways. And so if you read one of those writers and get this idea in your head of what this word means, and then go into Aristotle and bring that definition of that term with you, you're going to run into trouble in Aristotle, because when he uses that word, he uses it differently and it has a different meaning. So we need to understand how definitions are made and make sure that a definition that we use is actually a true definition. And we'll learn about doing that in this introduction by Porphyry. So to prepare for the doctrine of the categories of Aristotle, to understand how definitions are correctly formed, and in short, to those things which pertain to division and demonstration. These are the 3 purposes he gives for this introduction. What he's talking about there when he talks about division and demonstration is that any class of things, like if we take a thing like animal, and we think of animal as a container in which all animals are contained. But then as we look into that container, we see all these animals. We find that among those animals, divisions can be made, and the animals can be divided into different classes. So we can take this large container called animal and now divide it into different groups. For example, we can create man, and we can create fish, or we can create bird. We can separate animal into different divisions. And then what's important is that anything that can be said about the entire container, all of the animals, can also be said of the individual animals. So dividing things from genus into species is related to demonstration, which is forming arguments, and we'll see how that works as we study this. So Porphyry gives us 3 reasons why it's important for us to clarify the meaning of these terms: genus, difference, species, peculiarity, and accident. The first reason is that it will help us study Aristotle's categories, which we're concerned about in classical reasoning. Secondly, it will help us to understand how true definitions are formed. And thirdly, it will help us to understand how classes are divided into species, and that will help us with reasoning, because as we'll see, there's a rule of reasoning that depends on our ability to understand genus and species. We'll see that later in this book. All right, so 5 things we need to learn, 3 reasons why it will be good for us to learn them. Okay? What are Porphyry's sources? Where does he get his information from? He says, I will endeavor to discuss for you what has been delivered on this subject by the ancients. Okay, so what Porphyry intends to do is go back to the teaching of the ancients, the ancient philosophers before his time, and what they taught on these 5 terms, so that we can understand what those terms meant, not just to Aristotle, but also other ways in which they were used, so that we can understand exactly what Aristotle means, but also be aware of how other philosophers used those terms. Okay? In the second paragraph in chapter 1, he says, my meaning is that I shall omit to speak about genera and species, whether they have a subsistence in the nature of things, or have an existence alone in the mere conceptions of the soul. And if they have a subsistence in the nature of things, whether they are bodies or incorporeal, and whether they are separate from sensible things, or insensible things, and about these have their subsistence. Now, that's a a mouthful. But what I want you to understand is Porphyry saying, I'm not talking about that stuff. So we don't need to get into the details of what he's talking about there, because he's saying all of those questions and all of those issues, these complex issues about these topics, we're not going to discuss those in this book. We're just going to talk about something simple. We're just going to talk about the meanings of these terms, not ask questions about what exactly they are, how they exist, whether they actually exist or they're only ideas in our minds, things like. We're not going to talk about those things. So even though the first sentence in the second paragraph can be confusing, realize he's saying what he's not going to talk about. So it's really not important. And he explains why. He says, a discussion of this kind is most profound and requires another and greater investigation. Now, that investigation that he's talking about is the study of metaphysics, which is a different philosophical science. Okay, so those issues that he lists there at the beginning of the second paragraph, those are topics that are studied in metaphysics. They're not appropriate in this introduction that he intends for someone who's about to get started in the study of Aristotle's categories. That study is for metaphysics. Okay, so don't be discouraged and don't get confused by that second paragraph. He's simply making a list of profound topics that he is not going to discuss because they belong to the study of metaphysics. All right? He says, in what manner, however, the ancients, and especially the peripatetics, discussed these and the other proposed objects of inquiry in a more logical manner, I will now endeavor to show you. Let's clarify a few things here. In what manner the ancients, and especially the peripatetics. The peripatetics was, or the peripatetic school of philosophy was the followers of Aristotle. They were called the peripatetics. So he says, in what manner the ancients, and especially the Aristotelians, discussed these and the other proposed objects of inquiry in a more logical manner, I will now endeavor to show you. So note that to Porphyry, Aristotle and his followers were the ancients. Okay? So what he's going to do is explain for us in this introduction what the ancients, and especially the Aristotelians, taught on these topics of genus, difference, species, peculiarity, and accident. These 5 terms that are crucial for us to understand, to rightly understand Aristotle's categories. So that's all for chapter 1. It's just those 2 brief paragraphs, a simple introduction to his introduction, and then in the following chapters, we're going to study what genus is, what difference is, what species is, what peculiarity is, and what accident is. And because all of these are similar to each other, we're going to set them up side by side, compare them, and explain how they're different and how they're similar. So we have a really clear understanding of what each of them is and what each of them is not. That's the knowledge that Porphyry says we need to get started in the study of Aristotle's categories. Okay, so that's all for chapter 1. What I'd like you to do now is go on your own, study that lesson, make sure you read through it from beginning to end, make sure you understand everything in it by careful study, complete the lesson assessment, and when you're able to do that, we'll move on to lesson 2 and begin chapter 2 of Porphyry's introduction. If you have any questions about any of the content of your lesson, if you need any help with assignments, you need to make an effort to contact us and ask for help. Our help is always available, but you need to do the work of a student and let us know when you need some help. If you contact us, we'll help you as much as you need, but you need to make the effort to study, which is what a student does, and to get your assessments done. And to reach out for help when you need it. Okay, that's your job. When you get done with this lesson, I'll be ready for you with a new video for lesson 2, and we'll just keep marching on as fast as you can as you work through these lessons. God bless your studies.